Music of Charles Mingus, composer, performer, leading figure of experimental jazz. Charles Mingus is one of the most highly regarded creators of modern jazz. But this program is about a controversial music, sometimes strange in sound, unusual in structure, intellectual, often undanceable, unsingable, serious. It is considered by some critics a new flowering of jazz, and by others a dead end of the art. It is the jazz that came to prominence in the 1950s. In addition to Charles Mingus, this program will present Cecil Taylor, one of the most radical jazzmen to gain international attention. Our host is the distinguished novelist and social critic Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man. Jazz critic Martin Williams will comment on the new jazz and the experimenters. This program takes place at the Village Gate, a New York nightclub that specializes in contemporary jazz.
I'm Ralph Ellison. The composer of the music which we have just heard is Charles Mingus, and it was played by Mr. Mingus and his group. It is called The Arts of Tatum and Frederick Webster, and it is the work of one of the most restless and creative of the modern jazz experimentalists. In the beginning, jazz has been nothing if not experimental, and the experimental attitude sprang from its very creators. As practitioners of an outlaw art, jazz musicians could create free of the concerns of status and respectability. This freedom was expressed in their choice of instruments, in their playful manipulation of sound, in a wild freedom with harmony and counterpoint, in a ceaseless search for rhythmical variety. Jazz grew from an attempt to express with musical instruments the sound and the style of the Negro American voice, as raised in prayer, protest, shout, and song. It was an attempt to humanize the world in terms of sound, an effort made with musical means to impose the Negro American sense of time upon the larger society and upon the world of nature. Early jazz was by no means an intellectual music. It was, however, marked by a highly conscious sense of its sources in its own tradition. While it drew from the European musical tradition, it was instinctively aware that its goals were different. How does the new experimentalism differ from the old? For one thing, jazz today exists in a climate wherein a certain piety has developed toward the goals of so-called serious music, wherein experimentation is less a means toward achieving expressiveness than a value in itself. And for some Negro musicians, it has become a musical route to social respectability and to a wide acceptance among the cult of jazz intellectuals. For the most serious of these composers, however, the breaking down of the wall between jazz and modern European music has posed the problem of absorbing that music without losing touch with their own tradition. This has created a clash of styles, and one might say that the main musical motive of the experimentalism is to absorb, to Americanize the most recent developments of European classical music. The music of Cecil Taylor is, I think, a most interesting illustration of that struggle.
Number 1 by Cecil Taylor. My name is Martin Williams. By now, the radical innovations of the 1940s in jazz, the music of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, which sounded so startling when one first heard it, is a part of the mainstream of the music. And it's quite evident now in the 60s that there is a new kind of jazz, that jazz has its avant-garde just like any other art. It was evident actually in the music of Cecil Taylor, quite evident by 1958. And Taylor's music has certainly continued to develop since then. Cecil Taylor has attended an American Academy of Music. He knows 20th century European composition, but he also knows the jazz tradition thoroughly, and he approaches the music of Duke Ellington or Thelonious Monk with a real reverence. His is not typical of the avant-garde at all, because Cecil Taylor's is a very individual music, and many of the players in the avant-garde are equally individual. But if I were to say anything about what they all have in common, it would be something like this. Jazz players today approach improvisation with a new kind of freedom, if you will. Traditionally, they've made their variations by playing on a melody or by playing on a structure which had melody implied, an underlying chord sequence, what you and I might call simply an outline. Today, players want to make up their melodies without necessarily referring to the theme or its outline. They want to feel free to depart spontaneously from either of those perhaps inhibiting things. Cecil Taylor's next piece will have its introduction by the composer.
Music is the building of sound structures. The piece that you're about to hear will contain an anacrusis complex, the first statement, the shape of what is to be, its form, the possibility of the other. It will then proceed to areas which will contain melodic and percussive divisions. The unifying link of the piece will be its rhythm, which will consist of regular and irregular measurement of coexisting bodies of sound. The philosophical premise that this music is based on is that man begins a transliteration of the mean fact toward symbolic representation when mind and body move recognizing their singularity, therefore their unity, and therefore their sanity. The question is were the economic and social factors determining an artist's existence those which permit the expression of time through time to one whose consumption is unlimited, or were they the producers for others? The name of the piece will be Octagonal Skirt and Fancy Pants. Octagonal Skirt and Fancy Pants by Cecil Taylor and his group.
I'm sure that the name Charles Mingus would be written large in the history of jazz, if only because he is a very great bass player. He is, first of all, for me, one of the few bass players in jazz history, certainly not the only, but one of the few who has the emotional impact and the technique, the presence, to borrow an actor's term, to be a highly effective soloist, one of the very best. He's been called by one man the Segovia of the bass, and not without reason. But Charlie Mingus, in addition to being a great soloist, has reevaluated the function of his instrument in jazz, particularly in ensemble. Mingus's bass often does not merely accompany the music, but fits into it. He improvises behind the players a melodic line that sometimes is almost a kind of jazz counterpoint. But at the same time, he is improvising this part. He never interferes, and he can inspire. Oh, really, he can inspire almost any musician. I have seen him inspire budding musicians of promise into sounding like very great players. But Mingus came along in modern jazz after the innovations of the early players, Parker, Gillespie, and their immediate followers, had settled in. And he came along also as a composer. What he has is an ensemble style, an idea of jazz composition that goes beyond what the soloist can do. In other words, he came along when modern jazz needed a larger sense of form, and he offered it one. He's not the only such composer to come along in the idiom. One is Thelonious Monk. Monk contributed early to the style and then was rediscovered as a great composer and player. Another is John Lewis. Charlie Mingus has said that his music comes from Church, Charlie Parker, and Duke Ellington. It also comes from Charles Mingus.
The question of what is valid or invalid experimentation is ultimately unanswerable. Jazz is by definition an experimental form. The soloist experimented upon given themes, chords, riffs, and rhythms. The composer, arranger, orchestrator, leader, for often he was all of these, experimented with form, harmony, rhythms, tempos, instrumentation, voicing. Why then do we refer to the jazz of which Mr. Mingus is an outstanding exponent as new experimentalism? The newness lies in the matter of consciousness, or shall we say the matter of self-consciousness, and in many instances, I'm afraid, a matter of false consciousness. For much of the jazz that developed after bop no longer regarded itself from within its own tradition, but from within certain developments taking place in European music. Actually, there had occurred a clash between what are two streams of Western musical tradition, that of American jazz and that of European classicism. In the beginning, many listeners from outside the Negro-American background thought of jazz as ineptly played military or European dance music. It was assumed that the jazzmen were trying their best to play correctly and with traditional instrumental techniques. The rough sound of the brasses, for instance, was assumed to be the result of improper training, while in fact even the early conservatory-trained jazzmen bent their techniques quite consciously to give the voice the sound of the Negro blues. And behind all of these misconceptions lay the belief that jazz was a mere reflection of Americanized European music rather than a new native music which sought to express other values and which grew out of a most American sense of artistic freedom. And wonder of wonder, or outrage of outrages, this rowdy, vital, and most compelling music was a product of the most politically and socially unfree group in the United States. The problem of understanding jazz did not arise because jazz was shy about making its statement. It arose when that statement was interpreted in words. For the jazz background was a non-literary background whose nuances were best expressed in gesture, in attitude, and inflection, in fact, in all the complex moods summed up in the term Negro American. Any critic from outside this tradition must of necessity fall back upon his own values, and thus he may be unprepared to interpret what he has heard, even though he might himself be a trained musician. For he is likely to confuse the motives of jazz with those of classical European music. It has been such outsiders, well-meaning to a man, who sponsored the false consciousness of the new experimentalism in jazz. They were also promoters for the cult of intellectuals who imposed their romanticism on the new jazz, much as the early pioneers had imposed their own romanticism upon the figure of the American Indian. Now, beneath this romanticism and beneath all experiments lies a reality of life and experience which nourishes the beginning of jazz and which will continue to nourish its future life. It is this reality, notwithstanding European serious or respectable touchstones, which will provide the true standards of its validity. And now Charles Mingus will play one of his own compositions entitled "Don't Let It Happen Here."
One day they came and they took the communist people, and I said nothing because I was not a communist. Then one day they came and they took the people of the Jewish faith, and I said nothing because I was not a Jew. Then one day they took the Unionists, and I said nothing because I was not a Unionist. They burned the Catholic churches one day, and I said nothing because I was a Protestant. Then one day they came and they took me, and I could say nothing because I was as guilty as they were. I was as guilty of genocide as those who killed the 18 million people along with me. Yes, I was as guilty of genocide as those who killed the other people with me. And I say the only way we can avoid this is to look and speak out now, and don't let it happen here.